All right, ready? Romans 10, 9 and 10. I believed it once and then I got a life that will never end. I've got Christ in me. 2 Timothy 2:15. I'm not ashamed of anything. My way is cut so straight and clean. I know my Father's will. 1 Thessalonians comforts me. In the twinkling of an eye we all will be gathered together eternally, forever with the Lord. And it's all because of Romans 10, 9 and 10. I believed it once and then I've got a life that'll never end. I've got Christ, you've got Christ, I've got Christ in me. Whoopee! Very nice. All right. Let's see where we are this morning. Move my today. All right. And all right. So when we finished last week, Mary had seen Jesus at the gravesite, and if you'll remember, Jesus told Mary not to touch him because he had not presented himself to God yet. If you'll recall, Joey shared that Jesus was both the first fruits offering, which was a requirement of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This was the day when the first fruits offering was to be made during the feast week. He was both the first fruits offering for us and also the high priest who would make the offering. Remember, we studied many months ago that God calls him a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So he was both the offering and the priest making the offering. And as the high priest, he had to be ceremonially clean to make this offering before God. So Mary could not touch him until he had ascended to God. Also, I want to read before we dive into our records this morning, Romans 1:4. So Romans 1:4. And Romans 1:4 says what, Finn? Romans 1:4.
And declared to be the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by the resurrection from the dead.
Okay, so Romans 1:4 tells us that the resurrection marked Jesus Christ out as the Son of God. This was the proof beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jesus Christ was God's Son. We also know from what we read last week that Jesus Christ gave instructions to Mary about telling his followers that he was risen and that he was ascended to his Father. And we know from what we read last week that Mary did obey that. So let's go to Mark this morning and we'll read a summary of these same events from Mark. And it's Mark chapter 16 that we're going to. Mark 16. And when you get to Mark 16, we need to start in verse 9. And Joey, will you read verse 9 for us, please?
Now when Jesus was risen early the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 devils.
Okay. So in this verse, if you're looking at the King James Version, there is a comma that is misplaced. It reads, now when Jesus was risen early the first day of the week, comma, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene. Now, the way that reads with the comma where it is, it sounds like Jesus Christ was raised from the dead on the first day of the week, which was Sunday. Now, we've already done the calculations for this, and we know that's not true, right? Jesus Christ died around 3 p.m. on a Wednesday. He was buried sometime after his death at 3 and before sunset on that Wednesday afternoon. And if we count exactly 3 days and 3 nights later, he would have risen from the dead sometime between 3 p.m. and sunset at the same time he was buried on Saturday. So this comma is not in the right place. It should read instead, now having risen, comma, in other words, now after Jesus Christ rose from the dead, early the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene. So in other words, Jesus Christ did not rise on the first day of the week. It is on the first day of the week that he appeared to Mary. Okay? And let's continue in verse 10. Eli, will you read verse 10 for us?
And she went and brought glad tidings to those who were with him, who now were mourning and weeping.
That's right. And she went and brought glad tidings is what the Lamsa says. Yes, to those who were mourning and weeping. So those who were mourning and weeping would have included the women, right? The women who had come with him from Galilee and ministered to him. The women who had been the ones at the crucifixion as Jesus Christ endured his last hours of suffering. And they had been on hand also as Joseph of Arimathea took his body from the cross and buried it. They had purchased spices and oils to properly embalm him for his burial at their first opportunity. Apparently, most of the men were fearful and in hiding. However, by this time, both the men and the women were gathered together early in the morning to grieve the death of their master. And from there, hold your finger in Mark, but let's read from the book of John 20:18. That tells us a little bit more about what's going on that morning. So John 20:18, Cassidy.
Mary Magdalene came and told the disciples that she had seen the Lord and that he had spoken these things unto her.
Okay. And then what does it say back in Mark in verse 11, chapter 16, Mom?
11, chapter 16, verse 11.
Yes.
And they, when they had heard that he was alive and had been seen of her, believed not.
So they didn't believe what she had to say, right? And that response is very human. The first human reaction to God's great miracles is so often outright disbelief. People still today refuse to believe that God raised his son from the dead, and Jesus' disciples were still grieving over his death 4 days after it occurred. Now, I do want to explain, because the verses we just read, verses 9 through 11 of Mark 16, are what we call a parenthetic statement. They're inserted as part of an explanation. They're not told in the order in which they happened. They're told because they're trying to explain something that was happening. So in this case, if we went back and read verses 1 through 8, verses 1 through 8 tell about how Mary and the other women went to the sepulcher later Sunday morning. And they went because Mary had already been to the sepulcher early when it was dark by herself, and she had seen the grave, she had seen the grave closed, she had seen the angel, she had spoken to Jesus, and then she runs back like she was told to do and tells the others, which leads the women to get up and go to the grave. And we're going to see they go to the grave not because they believe that he's risen from the dead, but because they believe the part where Mary says, hey, the stone is removed from the door. And because of that, and they have their oils and spices, they're like, oh, good, someone moved the stone for us. We're going to go and anoint the body now that the grave is open. So we'll see that in a few minutes. But let me finish up here first. So Mary Magdalene, after seeing Jesus, went and told the disciples in an excited manner. She related that she had seen Jesus Christ and told them the message he had spoken to her. No one believed her. Therefore, the women went as they had planned to the sepulchre to anoint the body, and Mary Magdalene accompanied them. Details of the visit to this sepulchre are found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So we'll start in Luke. Luke 24 and verse 1. And Emerson, would you read that one?
Now upon the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they came unto the sepulchre bringing the spices which they had prepared, and
Certain.
certain others with them.
Okay, and let's read it from Mark. Mark 16, verses 2 and 3. And Alexander, will you read that?
Yeah.
Mark 16, verses 2 and 3.
And very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came unto the sepulchre at the rising of the sun. And they said among themselves, Who shall roll us away the stone from the door of the sepulchre?
Okay, this verse 3 is very confusing because it's translated, King James was translated from the Greek, and the Greek translates it as the women saying to themselves, Who shall roll us away the stone from the door of the sepulchre? In other words, asking, how are we going to get the stone rolled away from the door? Well, the problem with that is that Mary Magdalene, who had already been to the grave, had already seen the stone rolled away, had seen the angels, had seen the grave clothes, who had seen Jesus, knew the stone was rolled away, and she'd already told them that. And so the question would be, why would they be asking that question as they're traveling along? Who's going to roll away the stone for us? Well, let's talk about that. Here's what it says in Jesus Christ, our promised seed. It says, by the time of this visit, it was no longer dark as it had been when Mary went alone in John 20. Now it was just after sunrise. According to the Greek texts, the women, including Mary Magdalene, wondered who would roll the stone away for them to get into the tomb. Something is amiss here because John 20 makes it clear that Mary had learned on an earlier visit that the stone was already rolled away. She certainly would not come to the tomb after this wondering how to move the stone. The problem is one of translation. According to the Aramaic text that we have, Mark 16:3 should read, Who did roll the stone from the entrance of the tomb for us? So as they're traveling, they do believe the part that Mary's told them that the stone has been moved, and they're saying to each other, who was nice enough to move the stone for us? Who moved the stone? When Mark 16:3 is accurately understood, it is vitally informative and dynamic. From the women's point of view, the stone had been rolled away for their benefit, so they could get into the sepulchre to anoint the body. They desired to properly prepare Jesus' body, something they felt Joseph of Arimathea had not done. They were unaware that Nicodemus had already anointed the body, nor did they realize the real reason the tomb was open. Although the women believed the stone was rolled away, God's word makes it clear that they did not believe the rest of Mary's story. Having learned the stone was rolled away, they decided to take advantage of the opportunity to enter the tomb and anoint the body. Previously, they could not have done so because of the stone, the seal on the stone, and the guards. Now, all three obstacles had been removed. As expected, they found the tomb's entrance unobstructed. And what does it say in Mark 16:4, Finn?
16:4.
Yes.
And when they looked, they saw the stone was rolled away, for it was very great.
Okay, and let's look at Luke 24:2, Joey.
And they found the stone rolled away from the sepulchre.
Okay, in Mark, it says the stone was very great. It was a very large stone. This was not an easy thing to be removed from in front of the sepulchre. And that word away, which is used in both Mark and Luke, that word, the stone was rolled away from the sepulchre, doesn't imply that, well, it was just barely moved to the side or moved just enough that somebody could get inside. That word away implies that it was moved really far away from the opening of the sepulchre. All right, let's continue and look at the women's entrance into the sepulchre and what they saw. Luke 24:3, Eli. Mm-hmm.
And they entered in, but they did not find the body of Jesus.
Okay. And in Mark, it's verses 5-7, Cassidy.
And entering into the sepulchre, entered, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, clothed in a long white garment, and they were affrighted. And he saith unto them, Be not affrighted. Ye see Jesus of Nazareth, which was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. Behold the place where they laid him. But go your way, tell his disciples and Peter that he goeth before you into Galilee. There shall ye see him, as he said unto you.
Good. And let's read one more recording of this in Matthew. That's Matthew 28 and verses 5 through 7, Mom.
5 through 7. And the angel answered and said unto the women, Fear not ye, for I know that ye seek Jesus, which was crucified. He is not here, for he is risen, as he said. Come, see the place where the Lord lay, and go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead. And behold, he goes before you into Galilee. There shall you see him. Lo, I have told you.
The record in Matthew 28 has caused problems to many who have not studied it in light of the other Gospels. Matthew chapter 28 briefly summarizes events which occurred over a period of time. In Matthew's account, God does not tell in detail what happened between the first visit to the tomb the previous evening and the visit that morning. He does not make great distinction between the two visits because Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were involved in both of them. He summarizes and focuses on the actions of these two women when they are together at the tomb. We should also recognize the first use of the word "and" in Matthew 28:5 when it says, "And the angel answered," is the Greek word "day," and the Greek word "day" does not mean "and," it means "but." But the angel answered. And that Greek word "day" is not a temporal connective word. In other words, it doesn't tell us anything about the time between the event that's told just before and then this next event that's going to be told. It could be a short amount of time or it could be a longer amount of time. God's purpose in this section of Scripture is not to denote the length of time involved, but to focus on the two Marys and their experiences at the tomb. It is from the other Gospels we can learn more details regarding the time and the other women who became involved. So just because it helped me this morning when I was reviewing it again, we're going to back up and look at verse 1 and then go through again to verse 5 through 7. Because it's important to understand this, and we probably have discussed it, weeks ago, but if you're like me, I needed the refresher. So in verse 1 of Matthew 28, it says, In the end of the Sabbath, as it began to dawn towards the first day of the week, came Mary Magdalene and the other Mary to the sepulchre. And if you will remember, we talked about, so this is what we would call Saturday evening, but it began there, the end of their Sabbath was Saturday, and then the first day of the week was Sunday. They came in the evening, and they are looking at the sepulchre because they're coming regularly to see if the guards have left so that then they can get into the sepulchre to anoint Jesus' body because they're not aware that Nicodemus has already done this. So Mary Magdalene and the other Mary show up and they're looking at the sepulchre. The guards are still in place. The stone has still sealed off the grave. And at this point they leave. So that's what verse 1 is talking about. Okay? And then verse 2 begins with an "and." That word "and" is telling us that a new topic, a new event is being introduced. So after the two Marys leave, here's what happens next. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for the angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat upon it. His countenance was like lightning and his raiment white as snow. And for fear of him, the keepers did shake and became as dead men. So at some point after the two Marys had left, is when now the angel of the Lord comes down, rolls the stone from the door, and the keepers become like dead men, as it says. Mary and Mary were not there, clearly, because if they had been there, they would have been astounded at that moment and probably gone to run to tell people at that moment what they had seen. But they didn't see that, so they didn't say anything. They leave, and we know that Mary Magdalene comes back by herself while it's still dark early in the morning on Sunday morning. But Matthew doesn't tell us that piece. Matthew tells us they came Saturday late in the day. They saw the guards were still there. They left. Then at some point after they left before sunset, all of these events with the earthquake and the angel and the keepers, the guards becoming like dead men happen. Then what Matthew doesn't tell is early the next morning, Mary Magdalene comes by herself, but Matthew doesn't share that part. And then she goes back and tells the believers, and now the women have come back to the sepulcher later after the sun has now risen, still early in the morning. And that's where we pick up in verse 5, where it should read, "But the angel answered and said unto the women, Fear not ye, for I know that ye seek Jesus, which was crucified. He is not here, for he is risen, as he said. Come see the place where the Lord lay. And go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead, and behold, he goeth before you into Galilee. There ye shall see him. Lo, I have told you." So there's time that passes between each of these events, and some events aren't told, but the point of this summary is these are events in verse 1 and in verses 5 through 7 that Mary and Magdalene and the other Mary are both involved in. Okay, let me continue sharing with you what it says in Jesus Christ our Passover. It says, according to Mark 16:5, an angel was sitting on the right side in the sepulcher. This angel, a spiritual being, was a messenger from God who had come into concretion in the form of a man. That is why Mark refers to him as a young man. His countenance was brilliant. His long garment was as white as snow. The reaction of the women to this sight was one of great fear. The angel's first statement was a command, "Fear not." Then he instructed the women to tell the disciples that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead and that they should meet him in Galilee. With that, the women turned to leave the sepulcher, perplexed and amazed at what they had seen and heard. But before they left, another phenomenal event occurred, and we will read about that in Luke chapter 24. And Emerson, will you read Luke chapter 24 and verses 4 through 8, please?
4 through 8. And it came to pass, as they were much perplexed thereabout, behold, two men stood by them in shining garments. And as they were afraid and bowed down their faces to the earth, they said unto them, Why seek ye the living among the dead? He is not here, but is risen. Remember how he spake unto you when he was yet in Galilee, saying, The Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men, and be crucified, and the third day rise again. And they remembered his words.
And they finally remembered Jesus Christ's words, what he had been teaching them so many times during his ministry. The women had just seen the empty tomb and a young man, the angel, sitting. They heard the angel declare Jesus Christ's resurrection and reiterate his instructions to go to Galilee. This was far different from the corpse they had expected to find that morning. It is easy to understand why the women were perplexed and in great wonder as they turned to leave the site of the tomb. Then in Luke 24:4, they saw these two other angels standing by them. The phrase in Luke 24:4, "and it came to pass," indicates that a period of time had elapsed or gone by since verse 3. Once again, Luke 24 is summarizing the events, not giving every detail. That is how the Gospels complement, add to, and illuminate each other. These two angels, brilliant in appearance, reaffirmed what the first angel had just told them. Then the women remembered Jesus Christ's words. And let's go to Mark 16:8. Alexander, do you want to read verse 8?
And they went out quickly and fled from the sepulchre, for they trembled and were amazed. Neither said they anything to any man, for they were afraid.
So, in the Greek text, that word quickly, and they went out quickly, is not in most of the Greek text, it just reads, and they went out and fled from the sepulchre. And just as a reminder, at the end of the verse where it says, for they were afraid, that doesn't mean they were terrified or fearful. It meant they were in great awe. They were amazed. They were wondering at what they had just seen and heard. Matthew 28:8, Finn.
And they departed quickly from the sepulchre with fear and great joy, and did run to bring his disciples word.
Right. And again, that word fear, they were full of awe and wonder and amazement. Why did they now believe? Because the angels told them to remember the words Jesus had spoken unto them. The thought of Jesus Christ's words regarding his resurrection had not even entered the women's minds since the crucifixion. The angels' words jarred their memories, and then the women understood what had occurred. Overwhelmed, they ran to tell the disciples. The phrase, neither said they anything to any, means that they were so filled with awe and wonder, they told no one by the way as they ran to the disciples. Surely no one would have believed such a story anyway. Besides, they wanted to deliver the good news to those who cared about Jesus as quickly as possible. We must remember that we are studying the events of Sunday morning. By the time these women had come to the sepulchre and began running to tell the disciples, the guards watching the tomb had recovered. When the guards saw the tomb empty and remembered what had happened, they went to the city to inform the religious leaders. So the women were filled with awesome, that fear, that amazement, and that excitement about what had happened. These guys, when they woke up and realized their job was to guard this body and now the body was gone and they remember what happened, were probably experiencing some real fear about what was going to happen to them. All right, so in Matthew 28, Joey, would you read verses 11 through 15?
Now when they were going, behold, some of the watch came to the city and showed unto the chief priests all the things that were done. And when they were assembled with the elders and had taken counsel, they gave large money unto the soldiers, saying, say ye, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we slept. And if this come to the governor's ears, we will persuade him and secure you. So they took the money and did as they were taught. And this saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this day.
Okay. When I read this, it was interesting to me that the soldiers went to the Jewish leaders to discuss this situation and not to someone within the Roman government, whether it be Pilate or someone else. And it made me think about Joey's question about whether or not these were Roman soldiers that had been assigned or Levitical guards that had been assigned. And we still don't have the answer to that. Either way, these guys went to the Jewish leaders first, and these religious leaders essentially bribed the guards to lie about what happened to Jesus Christ. And what had happened that morning, what they had seen and experienced. The religious leaders, including the chief priests and elders and Sanhedrin, bribed the soldiers to tell a false story. The soldiers were to say the body had been stolen while they were asleep so that no one would believe that Jesus had been raised from the dead. The religious leaders had to have been both shocked and distressed by the report of the guards. This Galilean was going to haunt them even after his execution. The false story told by the guards that the body of Jesus had been stolen by his disciples was still being told and believed at the time the Gospel of Matthew was written. As a matter of fact, there are still people today who believe that lie. But such stories will never change the reality that God raised Jesus Christ from the dead. This is a lesson the religious leaders were to learn in the months and years ahead as Christianity spread. While the guards were reporting to the chief priests and elders, the women found the disciples and began declaring unto them what had happened at the sepulchre and repeated to them what Jesus had said about meeting him in Galilee. The disciples' response was very human: unbelief. The idea that Jesus was alive was far too good to be true. And let's read from Luke 24, verses 9 through 11. Eli, I think it's your turn, bud.
9 to 11.
Yes, sir.
And they returned from the tomb and told all these things to the 11 and to the rest. They were Mary of Magdala, and Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James, and the rest who were with them, who told these things to the apostles. And these words appeared in their eyes as delusions, and they did not believe them.
So the women share as a group. First, it's just Mary that comes, Mary Magdalene by herself, and shares this information, right? Nobody believes her. Now the women are coming as a unit, because now they've all seen and they've heard the words from the angels, and they're remembering what Jesus Christ taught them, and they're understanding that what he taught has actually taken place. They come back and share all of this, and the men still don't believe. These are the same men that deserted Jesus while the women had stayed near him during his crucifixion. Peter had already been to the grave. Remember, Joey, we read that with Joey last week. He had already been to the grave himself once and had seen the empty tomb and the grave wrappings, and didn't believe then, was walking away kind of confused and wondering. Now, after hearing the women's testimony, well, twice, because he heard it from Mary and then from this group of women, now he goes to the grave again for a second look. And that's where we're going to finish up today, in Luke 24 and verse 12, Cassidy.
Then arose Peter and ran into the sepulchre, and stooping down, he beheld the linen clothes laid by themselves, and departed, wondering in himself that which was come to pass.
Good. As of yet, Peter still had not seen Jesus Christ himself. However, he was astounded by the clear evidence that Jesus was really risen. Peter had been with Jesus throughout his ministry. He had seen Lazarus raised from the dead. He had heard Jesus predict his own death and resurrection. He had already seen the empty tomb with the grave clothes. Now he heard the women's testimony that they had seen him alive. Peter, after going to the tomb for a second look, began to fully realize the women were right. Jesus Christ indeed was risen. He left marveling within himself as he considered the spectacular implications of what had occurred. So as we end today, I just want to remind you, we're going to pick up next week with Jesus' appearance to the two men on the road to Emmaus, and then appearances that he starts having with some of his other followers. But as of yet, several people at this point have seen the empty tomb, they've seen the grave clothes, they've seen an angel, or perhaps more than one angel. But Mary at this point is still the only one that has seen the risen Christ. And so that's pretty cool. So, God, thank you for this time together in your word this morning. Thank you that when we rightly divide it, it just fits together like a hand in a glove and gives us such a beautiful picture of the events that transpired in the hours surrounding Jesus Christ's resurrection, and what an amazing moment that was in history. And so it's such a blessing just to learn more about it and about the people that were involved. So we're so thankful for that. We ask you to bless the rest of our day and our week, and we thank you for always being with us and loving us so much. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.